that's what I want to do. 15% better. Right. I'm going to switch over to my slide. I have to graduate in June, all right. I've lost my toolbar, so I can't go into presentation mode. I'm going to get my toolbar back. So here we go. So custom migration source plugins, fun and easy. So hi, I'm Ann Bonham. I'm a Drupal tech lead at Canopy. I am now recently become a co-facilitator of SFDUG along with Amy Jaron. I'm a painter, a dog fanatic, and a content migrator, as well as a Drupal engineer. And I've been doing Drupal for almost 10 years now. And I'm seen here in my studio making a piñata. It's actually a piñata of the COVID virus, which me and my friends beat the hell out of. So that was really therapeutic and fun. And I am Ann V at Canopy. I'm Benoodle on Drupal.org, and my pronouns are she, her. I want to acknowledge that I'm giving this presentation tonight from the traditional territory of the Ohlone peoples in the San Francisco Bay Area. You don't stop and look around once in a while. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So basically I'm going to describe what migration source plugins are and give a brief introduction to some of the, I mean, there are more source plugins than could possibly be covered in a single presentation, but I'm going to talk about some good examples of them. I'm going to talk about when a custom source plugin might be needed, and then how you go about extending existing plugins to write your custom plugins. I'm not going to be showing like writing plugins from scratch. I've written many custom source plugins at this point. All of mine have extended either SQL Base or Node or fieldable entity. I guess I've done some of that too. But so there's certain ones you're probably going to extend a lot if you work with migrations, and but there's a ton of them, and you know, there's some that you may never encounter, but they exist. I'm going to cover some code examples. I'm going to show 3 recent real-world examples of cool things that I did with custom source plugins, and then I'm also going to mention some debugging tools and tips, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So welcome, Jason. All right. The migration source plugins, what are they? So I liked Lullabot had a pretty concise, accurate description, which is a source plugin extracts data from a source as a row with properties. And that'll make more sense as we go, I think, but I think that is the crux of it. I think I would add to that that these other things that define what they are. So they're always defined in a PHP file, and that file is always going to be in module source plugin migrate source. And the great thing about that when I say always, that's going to be true in your custom module, that's going to be true in a contributed module, and that's going to be true in a core module. And what's great about knowing that is it's a great way to discover cool things. So now I'm in the habit now, whenever I download for the first time a new contributed module that I've never used before, one of the first things I do is check to see if it has a directory like that, and does it have any source plugins, and you can find some real interesting stuff that way. And I went through the core modules the other night doing that, and there were some astonishing finds. There were some I knew about, like, of course the Node plugin is in the Node module in core, but there were some interesting surprises I discovered too. So it's a cool thing just to look. They can extend an existing plugin. And I would say probably they usually extend an existing plugin, but if you want to be a real badass and write your own from scratch, nobody's going to stop you. And I don't know, you might need to someday, but I find that generally I can just extend what is already there. They can prepare row data. So this is where we can use prepare rows function. And I'm going to show you an example, 2 examples of that tonight, where we're preparing the row data. But I say can because they don't have to. So the first example I'm going to show you tonight is one that really just alters the query of getting the source, but doesn't really manipulate the data in any way. So sometimes they manipulate the data, but they don't have to. And then the fourth thing I would say is that they are our way of getting data from a whole variety of different sources. And here's just a list of some possibilities. It could be comma separated value or a spreadsheet. It could be a non-Drupal database. It could be a really old version of Drupal. It could be migrating from the same version of Drupal. It could be migrating the actual configuration for Drupal entities, not just content. I guess my talk tonight is really focused on content migration, and that is the bulk of my experience. But, I have migrated a little configuration, and I'm sure there are cool things you could do with configuration source plugins. All right. And then it's important to acknowledge that there are other really important plugins in the migration universe, and those are process plugins and destination plugins. And I'm not really going to cover those tonight. But I will say that before you get into writing a really complicated, like prepare row function in your custom source plugin, do check out, and on my last slide, I have a list of resources, and there's a list, I think, on Drupal.org of all the core process plugins that are available. And do look at that list and do familiarize yourself with that list if you're not already, because no point reinventing the wheel. So like one that I think Austin mentioned earlier tonight was the skip when empty, a process plugin. Like, yeah, definitely don't go it alone and write your own skip on empty logic, right? Although you won't be the first person to have done that, because I did that. So, so yeah, don't reinvent the wheel unless you have to. Okay, and then so I've already kind of alluded to this, but there's sort of three major groups of migration source plugins. There are the source plugins that come in core, in the various core modules. And so examples of those are the very, very useful SQL Base source plugin, the fieldable entity, from which fieldable entity is the one that, like the node, the D6 to D7 node plugin it's extending the fieldable entity plugin. And so then in your custom plugin, you might extend the node, or you might actually at some point need to write one that extends fieldable entity directly. So things can be extensions of extensions, if you will. And the list, it's an endless list, really, and constantly growing. And then there's, of course, contributed modules that provide source plugins. And here are some pretty popular ones, at least popular to me. So migrate source CSV is one that gets provided by the module of the same name. And that's useful if you are working with comma separated value data. There's a really handy module I discovered this year, migrate file to media module. That's really nice, because I don't know if you're in the same boat I'm in, but a lot of D7 sites didn't use the media module, even though they could have, but they didn't. And in their new D9 site, though, they want to embrace the media ecosystem. And so I've done a lot of migrations now where we migrate the file entities to file entities, and then we also write a migration that can generate the media entities from those file entities. So it's very cool stuff. Keep up the chat. All right, and then like paragraphs module, it provides a whole bunch of source plugins. I just listed two here, but one is field collection for dealing with field collections, so that you can migrate them to paragraphs, and then paragraphs item, which is how you can do like paragraph to paragraph migration plugins. And then then there are an endless number of custom source plugins that we can write. And I've listed here three kind of real world examples, and these are the ones that I'm going to dive into in detail next. So the first one is going to be where we write a source plugin that gets nodes, but only the ones that are tagged with a certain term. And then another one we're going to do is We're going to migrate, again, it's going to be nodes, node data, node to node, but that the node on the D7 side has a Unix timestamp field, which is basically a text field with a Unix timestamp in it. And I need to get it into a date field on the D9 site. So I'm going to show how I did that. And then the last one, if we have time for it, is it's a real edge case. I don't know that any of you will ever need to do this, but it's really neat. And it's a really good example of writing a source plugin that extends SQL Base. Because at first I was puzzled, like, when would you ever really even use it, except for like, migrating, like, I don't know, a WordPress site to Drupal or something like that. But it turns out there actually is a Drupal to Drupal migration scenario where using SQL Base does make a lot of sense. And that was this thing I did with the Brightcove media. There's a module called Brightcove Video Connector. So I'll talk about that. But that should be interesting. So I guess before I dive in, is there any questions you want to ask at this point?
No.
Okay, we'll have plenty of time at the end too. And feel free to dive in. There's such a small group. And okay, so as I mentioned, okay, so this first scenario is going to be the one where, so the scenario is this: we have a D7 site and we're going to migrate it and do a rebuild on D9. So the D7 site has an article content type. And on that article content type, there is a taxonomy entity reference field called article type. And I'll just say, for the sake of argument, it only has two terms in it. One is press releases and one is blogs. Okay. And so what the client wants, and for this particular client, it's important when we look at my code examples to understand that this client was a little peculiar in that they only wanted to migrate published nodes. They didn't want us to bring over unpublished stuff. And they also didn't want their revision history migrated, which is a little unusual, I think. And it's important because these code examples would be a little different if I had had to factor in for revisions. So keep that just in the back of your mind if you ever try to use one of these examples in your situation. And what the client wanted to do is they wanted to take those articles, and if they were tagged as a press release, they wanted them to be migrated into a press release content type on the D9 site. And if they were tagged as type blog, then they would be migrated into a content type called blog on the D9 site. And so I think this is a pretty common scenario. It's where people decide, hey, I really want to split a content type into a couple different content types, and I want to use how they're tagged with taxonomy terms to do that. And so to do this, we're going to extend the node source plugin, which comes with core in the node module. And all right, so let me know if this is how readable, if you can't read this. So this is kind of the most simple example of a custom source plugin that I thought we could start with. And like I said, it doesn't do any preparing of data or anything like that. So it's basically just riding on the coattails of what the node plugin does. And you can see that, oh, sorry, come back here. Okay. So basically all it's really doing is it's modifying the query that the node plugin normally runs. And what's nice about if you've worked with the node plugin at all, is that usually, like you see over here on the left where I have the actual YAML excerpt and it says source and then plugin. And so that has the name of my plugin. And you can see that in the annotation on the left that it's my migrate blog terms. And then the fact that I can say node type in my YAML and then what type it is, article, that isn't anything I wrote. That's coming from the functionality written in the node plugin that I'm extending. So I'm taking advantage of something that's already been provided. However, you'll see in my YAML on the left, I have that term and then blog in quotes. So that doesn't come with the node plugin. And so the way I made that work is, believe it or not, just this simple line of code here where it says if is set this configuration term, then we can add it as a condition to our query. And so that's really amazing. And not just for this, but for like any kind of thing. It allows you to abstract and like basically kind of pass a variable from your YAML to your source plugin. So super easy, right? Like it doesn't get much easier than that. That's incredible. When I saw that, I was like, that can't possibly work. It's too easy, but it really did. So that was great. And so now what's nice about the source plugin is in my scenario that I mentioned, like the YAML we're looking at on the left is the one that's going to create all the blogs on the D9 site. But you can imagine that once I'm got this working, I can just save it as and kind of just rename it and turn it into the one that's going to create the press release ones. And all I really have to change about it is change the term to press release, you know, so it's really neat, right? So really all this source plugin does is it looks, the other thing I'm doing is I am adding this condition for status is published. Because again, this particular client didn't want to bring over the unpublished stuff. So basically I just have this query. It's looking for published nodes of type article and that have the article type populated and that have the term blog. And that's really all you need to do. That's really cool. So that's a very simple one. Okay, so the next scenario. Any questions about that before I move on to the next scenario?
Just one. So that you're just overriding or copying and pasting the rest of the query function, right? The inner joins and all that.
Yeah, well, actually, like, for instance, let's pretend I wanted to write an even simpler source plugin. And this may be a silly example, but let's say I didn't have any of this complexity with the blogs and all that. What if I just wanted to write a source plugin that just limited the nodes being migrated to the published ones? In that case, this file, like I would, after status is value 1, I wouldn't have the inner joins. I wouldn't need that query, that last query condition. I would just literally have status 1 and then return query. Because basically I'm just modifying the query that the node plugin is already doing. And it's basically doing a query, you know, on that content type. It's taking the node type variable and it's doing that. And it's fun to go look at it. And I definitely encourage you, I should have taken a screenshot of that, but go into the core modules folder, look for the node module, and then go into source plugin migrate source, and you'll see the node for D7. Well, it's under a D7 folder there. You'll see the node plugin, and you can see the query that it uses. And but this is your opportunity to modify that query. If you wanted to write your own query completely from scratch, like maybe you had like custom entities that nobody's written a plugin for because they're unique to this one weird site you're migrating, then you really might start from scratch perhaps, or start from fieldable entity source plugin and like write your own completely unique query basically. But a lot of times you can just kind of like, you're kind of just, it's almost like thinking of it as like a query alter hook, even though it's not, you know, but it's kind of like that mindset, like I'm changing. There's already a query. I'm just changing it. Okay, so scenario 2, a little more complicated. So this is also a D7 to D9 migration. The D7 site has an event content type. But stupidly, that event node type has a field for closing date that is a Unix timestamp. It's not stupid, but anyway, it's not what I wanted, and it's not what the client wanted for the D9 site. I shouldn't say it's stupid. But we definitely want to migrate this to a, we want to migrate the data to a date, I don't know why I said date time field, a date field on the event node on the D9 site that we're building. So basically the goal of this source plugin is to get that Unix timestamp data from a field and then convert it to a format that can be digested by the D9 field. And again, this is going to be an example of extending the node plugin. So, and this one's going to be a lot longer. It's going to be on multiple screens. So I couldn't think of the best way to do this. So, and again, this client, they only want published nodes. So right off the bat in this one, I'm altering the query to include only the published nodes. But that's all I'm doing with the query in this case. That's all that's happening. And then under fields, this is where I can identify any fields that I'm interested in. And this text here is what actually shows up in the migration user interface. When you're looking, there's that screen you can go into to see like the details of each migration, and it shows like the mapping. Like that's where that text is coming from. So you're required to have it. It doesn't really do much for me, but I have to include that because I'm going to be using that field. Okay, and now we're going to take our first look at a prepare row function. So this is really common in source plugins, but as we saw in the first example, not all source plugins have this. But if you need to manipulate things, then we need this. So here I am getting a connection to the Drupal 7 database, and I do have, my migration is set up so that I am able to talk to my D9 database and my D7 database directly. And then this is basically going to query, it's first capturing in an array all of the closing date values. And then it's going to loop through all the closing dates, and it's going to do the date conversion that I need. So the first thing I need to do is take the Unix timestamp and convert it into a date, and I want it in that ISO format. And then, which is what the C signifies. I always forget the number of that ISO. Was it ISO 8604? Whatever. I'm really bad with remembering numbers, but I think you know which one I mean. And then, but then unfortunately, it wasn't giving it to me. At that point, I was able to get it into Drupal 9, but it was transposing things into Greenwich Mean Time or UTC. So I needed to do a little magic here to get things to keep my date times correct. So that's what's going on there with the time zone conversion. And then I had something pretty usable, but I just needed to trim off the last little bit, which I forget what that even was, but there was a few characters that had to be trimmed to make the date field happy. So I'm doing that there. And then that I start to assemble those into a closing dates array. And then if there are things in that array at the end of this run, I'm going to send it back. And remember that original definition I gave of a source plugin is that it returns your rows of data with properties. So this is where we're seeing properties in action. And this is just so cool. So I basically just say, I can name it anything I want. So I'm calling it prepare multiple closing dates. And then I'm giving it that array. And so back in my YAML, which we see here on the left, you can see it in action. Now, in this case, at the top where I'm saying source, I'm declaring my plugin, which is the name of this entire plugin. But then when you actually get to the field closing date field, we do a sub process. And we can use the source that we've prepared, and I just call it by the name that I gave it over in my source plugin. And then I'm going to process value, because if you were to look in this array that it gets, you would see that it has value keys. And so that's why I'm referencing value is value. If that makes sense. So it's kind of a lot to digest, but it's pretty cool. And then what it means is that when the migration is running, that field closing date is getting the date in a format that it can stomach, that it can import and parse and be happy with. And so yay. And so now we've converted it. So any questions about that
one? I do have a question. I was wondering, why didn't the field data came along with like the regular plugin? Like it looks like you are using prepare row to make another query to fetch the data, but I thought that any field attached to the entity would be fetched automatically. So that's what I find. That's what I don't understand.
Why I had to call out that field in particular? Is that what you mean?
Yes, like in the, I think the previous slide or 2 slides before, where you do, yeah, that what when you do the query to the D7 database. So you're querying the table that contains field data for the closing date field. I thought that any field attached to your content type would be automatically fetched for you. So I don't quite understand why you had to.
I think you're right, actually. I think that's a fair criticism. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think you're right, though. I don't think I needed to do that first query at all, actually. No, that's a good point.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair question. I think that I'm trying to remember why I ended up doing that. I feel like there was another migration I wrote before this that there was a reason I needed to do that. And then like, I think when I started writing this one, I think it was kind of like, oh, I'll base it on this other one that was similar, but like I didn't step back and think about how that could be. Yeah, maybe I just didn't know at the time that I could do that. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that could be shortened quite a bit. Because really, you're right. I mean, the important thing is the manipulation, but I don't think I did need to go through all of that to get.
Thank you.
Thank you. I did refactor that. Okay, how are we feeling about another example? So, okay, this one's a little weird. So has anybody here used a contributed module called the Brightcove Video Connector module? I had never had either, so it's kind of new to me. But we had a client who's using the Brightcove video service, which is kind of like a Vimeo or a YouTube. And so they use it, and they have over 2,500 videos on it, and with lots of metadata, descriptions, and thumbnails, and all kinds of great stuff. So we're building this G9 site for them, and they definitely wanted to bring over all their Brightcove stuff, and they also wanted to continue to have an integration with their Brightcove service. So we evaluated the Brightcove Video Connector module, and we really liked it, and it's really cool. The way it works is you enable it, and then you give it the API credentials of your clients or your service at Brightcove. And then basically what it does is it's tied to cron, but when cron runs, it synchronizes all of your Brightcove video content from the service to Drupal. And what it does is it creates these little custom entities that are just called Brightcove video entities. So that's great. So we installed the module, we ran cron, and voila, we had all 2,500 of their beautiful Brightcove videos along with all of their metadata like that. It was fantastic, right? But they weren't media entities. They're these Brightcove entities, and we want to embrace the media ecosystem, and we want to have consistency, and we want all media on the site that content editors work with to be media entities. So they have, when you enable the Brightcove Media Connector module, there's an add-on helper module that's optional that's called something like Brightcove Media thing. And I thought, that's what I need. I'll enable that. Well, that's great. And when you enable that, what that gives you is the ability to, it gives you I forget what you call that, like a source field type that you can use on your media entity type or bundle that you define. But at that point, all that means is that I can basically create a type of media entity called Brightcove video media entity. And I can have it use the special field that this helper module gives me. And that allows me then to say, I want to create a new Brightcove video media entity. What I do is I say, add new media entity, like I normally would. Select the type as Brightcove video media entity. And then you basically have a widget that allows you to start typing the name of one of the Brightcove videos and then select it. And then you select it and you save the media entity. And now you've got a media entity that represents one of those Brightcove media or Brightcove video entities that you've brought over. But you have, in my case, you have 2,500 of these, and they don't want to go through and manually do that 2,500 times. So then I was like, okay, how am I going to solve this? We want something that will basically, so in this case, we're not even really talking about migration anymore in the classic sense. We're kind of talking about using migration to auto-generate content, right? I mean, which is kind of the same thing, but it's kind of different. And so this was a case where I needed to understand, well, what do these Brightcove video entities, these custom entities that the module brings in, what does that look like in the database? Because I needed to understand, like, what am I going to be migrating from? So what was really cool about this module is that it delivers just one table to the database, and it's called Brightcove. And that table has all the properties. So all that metadata I mentioned, thumbnail images, short description, long description, author, duration, there's a ton of them. They're all properties. So because they're all properties on this custom entity, everything's in one table. So it's just one big table called Brightcove with like 20 columns, but description, short description, thumbnail, etc. So seeing that, it told me right away that, okay, the source plugin I'm going to write is going to be extending SQL Base. So this is a job for SQL Base. Because Node isn't going to help me. Fieldable entities isn't going to help me. This thing doesn't have fields. Now it is, I should mention that this entity that this module gives you is fieldable, but we haven't added fields to it, nor do we plan to. We're going to just use what we get from this custom entity and all its properties, and we're going to map those properties to custom fields on a media entity. So are you guys with me so far? Do you understand what it is I'm trying to do? It's really a weird scenario. It's almost more complicated than the solution. All right. But it's really cool. Okay, so you're not going to probably extend SQL Base every day of the week, but this is a really good case for it. All right, and this is a really long one. Okay, so the beginning just starts with extend SQL Base, and SQL Base is provided by Drupal's Drupal Migrate core module. And okay, so you have to do a lot of work in a SQL Base kind of plugin. You really do have to enumerate all the it says fields here, but these are really actually properties on the source in the source data. They're going to be fields though when I'm done with them. And for this to work, I have to list them in this fields thing. Now the real one was a lot longer actually. I shortened it just to make this more screenshotable. Okay, and then after that, you do have to identify the IDs, and I've just done this. Honestly, we're using the BCV ID as the unique key, is I think is what I understand this is to be doing. And then we get into the prepare row for this. And what we're doing here is we're basically just querying that, what are we doing here? Oh, I forgot about this. Hang on, I left something out. So I glossed over a little detail. To make things even more complicated with this one is that another thing that this module does is it actually imports a taxonomy called Brightcove taxonomy or Brightcove tags. And it actually, in the Brightcove service, there actually is a taxonomy, and it actually kind of imports that. And so, in other words, there's actually one of the properties on the Brightcove entity is like an entity reference property of terms. So what I'm doing here with this prepare row is all about preparing these tags. Because if it weren't for that, I wouldn't have had to actually do a prepare row at all in this scenario. I would have had to just do, the definition of the fields, and that would have given me the source data I needed to work with in my YAML to map all my fields to. But in this case, I also had to do this prepare row to get things. And you can see over on the left where I say field Brightcove video tags. I'm using a core provided plugin, skip on empty. This is a good example of how you can chain plugins. And then I'm using my prepare multiple tag source that's coming from my prepare row. And then I'm also having to explode it because it is a array that is bringing back with multiple tags. And so when this runs, then, and you can see here at the end, I'm showing you that my destination is a media entity. And so I manually, at this point, I manually configured a media entity called Brightcove Video. I made sure that it had its, what do you call that thing now? The main field that does the media, I think it's called the source media field. I make sure that it's using I'm not sure if I'm using the right terminology, the widget, if you will, that's provided when you enable the Brightcove add-on for media. And then basically it does its thing. So it's basically just going into the database table, and for each one of these videos, it's taking all their properties, and then I'm mapping each property to basically a field with a similar name. So if the property was short description, then you guessed it, the field on the new entity I created is going to be that short description, sort of thing. And so that really worked. And then what I did with it is I installed, there's a nice module, shoot, I'm not going to remember the name, but it's called something like Migrate Cron or Cron Migrate. And so it allows you to, there's a lot of other ways you could do this, but I was lazy, and it's a nice little contrib module for cronning your migrations. So what I did is then I croned this to run every time cron is run. And so what's going to happen on this site, which is kind of crazy to think about, but the Brightcove video connector module is every time cron runs, it's going to run out to the Brightcove service and say, hey, are there new videos that I don't know about at all on the service? And if there are, it's going to bring them down to those custom entities. And then I think probably on the next cron run, my cron migration is going to run and say, are there any of these Brightcove entities that don't have a corresponding media entity yet? And if so, I'm going to go ahead and generate those now. So any hour of the day, the site will be getting new Brightcove video entities, but also Canon will be getting new Brightcove. What I'm not sure about is I don't think that both can happen on the same cron run, but I'm not sure how that's going to flash out. Fortunately, no one really cares except me. So yeah, but yeah, so that was my third real world example. Any questions about that? All right. Okay, and so the only way I was able to figure out any of this stuff is with debugging tools. And so one I really want to recommend is the Migrate Devel module. It's not kind of a blurry screenshot, but it's really nice. It gives you a flag you can use. So when you're running these migrate commands by Drush, you can limit. One thing you can do is it allows you to limit. So you can limit it by one. Did that a lot. So I could just, sometimes you just want to see what one source record looks like so that you understand what's going on. Or you could limit it to 10 or whatever. And then the other really great thing is it has a flag you can use called -- migrate debug. And that's what gives you this output we're seeing. There are other ways to debug. I also sometimes use just my Xdebug, and PHP Storm is excellent. You can just add breakpoints to your source plugin. So that's another way to kind of get at the same information. And I also am a big fan of PHP-MyAdmin. I like the command line for a lot of things, but I really like having a graphical user interface for my database. It's just a really nice way to learn and really visualize how the data is. That's, it really gave me the direction to go with this Brightcove thing. Because once I saw that it was a single table, it's like, my decision was made for me, like what I needed to do. And another thing that has been really helpful to me is it's under resources. I don't know if anyone else has been checking this out, but on Drupal Tutor, which is a great service, and usually you pay for their courses, and I highly recommend them. I've taken a few of them myself. But lately, Wayne has been doing this really cool, very generous thing, which is he's been rebuilding the Drupal Tutor site. And he's been doing it on like live stream video. And he's made all of those available for free at this drupaltutor.com live link. And it's really just the whole series is excellent. It's a masterclass on how to build a site in Drupal. But videos 3 and 4 in the series deal very heavily and in depth with dealing with migrating, really all aspects of migration, including source plugins. And it's also just fun to watch because in episode 3, he really struggles with migrating some paragraphs. But it's excellent to see that. It's excellent to see. It's a good introduction to what's involved in migration and how to get yourself unstuck when you feel hopelessly stuck, and you will feel hopelessly stuck. And then I've listed some other kind of basic resources that I have found useful. And as I mentioned, that there is this very helpful list of process plugins, and that's where you can learn about things like skip on empty. And as we saw in that last example, I'm basically chaining a process plugin with my source plugin. So they kind of, the distinctions between them get blurred quite a bit. And a lot of the prepared row stuff I'm doing, I suppose you could do in a process plugin as an alternative. I just kind of gravitate towards the source plugins at this point, but I'd like to start doing more things with process plugins, custom process plugins. And I still haven't found a need for destination plugins. Like maybe you guys could illuminate me on like, I'm not real clear on when you would use a destination plugin. Is anybody clear on that?
I've only written one in like ever, and I do not fully understand why I did it.
But you did it and it worked. There you go. Yeah, so that was my talk. Are there any other questions? I'm happy to try to answer general questions about content migration also. It doesn't have to be necessarily about source plugins. Again, I probably should have said this in the very beginning. I'm not an expert in migration. I've just been learning a lot lately, and I feel like I'm starting to kind of get the hang of it, but still a lot to learn.
So one question. So all of these were done from like upgrading one database to Drupal 9, right?
Yeah, they're all database to database migrations that I've done. Yeah.
Okay. So then do you have any idea how you would do this if it was like one database to another?
Oh, that's what these are. These are
Oh.
database. Like that's what I mean. Yeah.
Oh, okay,
Although
okay.
the Brightcove one was an example of a database consuming itself, right?
Yeah.
But the other ones were, two separate Drupal databases. And now, as I mentioned before when we were chatting, that I had it a little easy on these. Well, one of them was the hard. So they were kind of easy to set up database to database because both sites were on Pantheon, and that does kind of make things a little easier for me. But on one of them, it was challenging because they were on separate Pantheon accounts. So I did have to, set up a secrets file and do some special stuff in my settings, PHP, so that basically my D9 site can authenticate and connect with the D7 database that is also on Pantheon. But it is cool that you can do it across accounts, but to do it, you just have to have the credentials in a secrets file and then have the settings parse that and use it. But I would say that like if you were doing a CSV migration, I don't know. Having not done a lot of CSV migration myself, I don't know how much I would use source plugins because there would be a temptation to do data manipulation in the spreadsheet, right? I mean, I could imagine where that might be, and I don't know, that might make more sense in some cases, I mean, like seriously, if all you want is to just get the published nodes, well, you could just sort your spreadsheet by status, right? And then just delete all the rows that are unpublished, and you don't need to write a custom source plugin now.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Right. So yeah, I think probably it's because I've had to do so much database ones that I've had to, out of survival, had to learn more about source plugins, because I guess you do still have that temptation, even though, I mean, I could, clean up the data on the D7 site and avoid source plugins that way too. But of course, you ultimately want these things usually to be iterative. And that's why I'm such a big fan of database to database migrations instead of CSV, because, if I only had to run a migration once, then by all means, why not use data export and create a CSV and be done with it. And in fact, I probably would do that if I knew for some reason I only was going to run this migration once. But usually in these projects, they're like 6 months, a year long. And so we'll start migrating the content on day one of the project, and it might be a year later and we're still having to run Delta migrations because, we don't put the client in code freeze for a whole year, as much as I might like to. That just doesn't get apply. And so you're going to have to do these over and over again. And the thought of having to re-export and clean up CSV over and over again is just too daunting on these big projects. So I really like doing the database thing. But I've never had to migrate from a non-Drupal database. I'm curious if any of you guys had to do that yet? Like a WordPress database, or just like
I've done it once, I believe, where it was in the very beginning of Drupal 8, where what was it? Some department still had most of the websites on like a PHP server and serving out HTML and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of built took broad swaths and just built a scraper, scraped out only the HTML, turned it into XML, and then used that as the source for the migration.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
It was a big trick, and you just have, big generalizations. Otherwise, you have to go through every single page and just okay, so when the HTML body starts, the body tag starts, that's where we want. And when it ends, nothing outside of that.
God, yeah, that's tricky. Yeah, I haven't had to do that yet. Yeah, that's the thing about migration too. It seems like you're almost never asked to do the same thing twice. Like I'll start thinking, oh, this is great that I finally figured out how to do this. So now next time I have to do this, like, and this might be like, oh, the next time I have to migrate field collections to paragraphs, I'll know how to do it. This time it was murder, figuring it out, getting it to work, but next time it'll be easy. But I'm starting to realize that there probably won't be a next time. Like every migration I've had to do so far has been so different. There's so many different scenarios that I start to think, I'm probably never going to do the same thing twice. Well, one pattern that keeps emerging is this pattern of having to migrate a file entity site to a media site. Like that seems to be a recurring pattern that I've had to do a few times now. But I realize at some point I'm probably going to get a D7 client who is using the media module. And then that's interesting because I've actually never done that migration, just a media entity to a media entity. And it sounds really straightforward, but it's like, I don't know. I don't know how well that's going to work until I do it. Yeah. And like, I don't know if anyone's had to do paragraph migrations, but that's in the Drupal tutor video that I mentioned, the one where Wayne almost breaks down in tears at one point. It's over the paragraph plugin, and it's tricky, but he comes back and in video 4, he announces that he has spent the weekend and he has made a little module, which I don't know if he's contributed back yet, but I think he plans to, but it just provides a very easy to use paragraph source plugin. Although I'm not quite sure how different or why, because the paragraphs module does have a paragraph item plugin. So I'm not sure. Actually, I'm not sure why he didn't use that. I can't remember now if he tried that first. He might have. And I have had that experience, and I don't know honestly if it's user error on my part, and I can't remember now which ones it has been, but there have been times when I've tried to use a contrib. Don't think it's ever happened with a core one, but with a contrib source plugin that I've tried to use, not extend, but just use. And I haven't been able to get it to work. And I don't know, I'm probably doing something wrong in my YAML or not understanding it correctly. But there was at least one case where I just couldn't get it to work. And I did end up writing my own version of that source plugin, and I got mine to work. So I probably should file an issue in that module's issue queue and find out, because it was either user error or it was a bug. So I was not a good citizen in that case. I think I had a tight deadline and I did not report it. Now I'm not probably going to remember even which module that was, but yeah, lots of things to migrate. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording now, but we can still chat.